Hi guys, it's Rory here and welcome to the Football Heritage Podcast. Hope you're enjoying everything that our fantastic podcast has to offer so far this year. Firstly, I'm here to tell you that our brand new patron exclusive feed, the Football Heritage Extra, is now live. You can subscribe for £3 per month and that gives you access to an additional exclusive podcast every Thursday. We've designed our patron exclusive content to be a wee bit more casual, more niche and full of exclusive insights and interviews with our friends, contributors and other people working within football. Links to subscribe are in all of our episodes, show notes as always. Looking forward to seeing you over there. Secondly, if you enjoyed last week's show, it would mean the world to us if you could leave a review on Apple and Spotify, or if you're listening on YouTube, a comment and a like. It really helps the algorithm pick us up and does so much for pushing us in front of new listeners every week. Please remember as well to leave a comment on our episodes on whichever platform you're listening on. One of our favourite things is engaging with you guys and being able to speak with you about the conversations that we're having every week. Lastly, please remember to visit our website to read our articles and see what other projects we're working on at the moment. Or if you like, come and join us on our social media for daily posts and content related to the heritage of football across the world. We're always up for a chat, so if you have any questions, suggestions or feedback, feel free to DM us on any of our socials or email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. I think that's about everything that I need to plug at the moment. Thanks once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and I'm joined today by Mark Orton.
Thank you.
It's good to have you on, Mark. Thanks very much for joining me this morning. I actually should say Dr. Mark Orton. It's an important distinction. Today we're going to be talking about the history and the culture of the Argentina National Football Team and its history, but specifically the origins of the national team in Argentina and the culture surrounding it in the modern day. As we know, Argentine fans are incredibly passionate, but unlike other countries, they're also particularly passionate about their national team. And I know that maybe might not make a lot of sense at the moment. A lot of people will be sitting listening, well, you know, I'm passionate about my national team, etc. But this really kind of transcends what we understand as being passionate supporters of your national football team. So we're going to dive into all of these things again, really focusing on the origins of the Albiceleste and the journey that they've taken into the modern era, and talking about the culture that surrounds them from a supporter's perspective, and talking a little bit about Argentine football culture more widely as well. But Mark, just before we kick things off, tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself first of all.
So basically I came into studying history of Argentine football, mainly following a random holiday in 2001. Went to a few games. Obviously I've been a football supporter all my life, but that's the first time I really got to know Argentine football sort of on a close-up basis. As a result of that, I got really interested in sort of Argentina and the South American continent. Ended up going to Portsmouth University to do a degree in Latin American Studies, the 2004, and as part of that degree, ended up in Argentina for a year between 2006 and 2007, whilst working on an English-speaking newspaper and researching my undergraduate dissertation on migration Argentine footballers. Later on, I did a master's degree at De Montfort University at the International Centre for Sports History and Culture, where I got distinction and ended up getting an opportunity to do a PhD in national identity and football in Argentina.
Fantastic. Yeah, such a massive amount of experience. Of course, I've been in touch with you a few times for tips on football in South America more generally, so this is really where your expertise is coming in. And the angle that we're really looking at this podcast episode from is through the lens of Mark's book, which is coming out on May 11th. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that book, first of all, Mark?
Yeah, so it's entitled From More to Messi. It's a history of the Argentine national football teams, both men's and women's, going back to the initial men's international in 1902. And the Moore in the title is Juan Jose Moore, of Irish descent, who was a member of the first Argentine team in 1902. Some say he was the first captain, others say otherwise, so there's no definitive information confirming that, but say I thought it was a nice link between the very start and the up to date with, obviously, who doesn't know who Lionel Messi is.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's actually quite a nice place for us to start our discussion today, talking about Moore and the impact that migration actually had on football in Argentina in the early years. A lot of our listeners, especially our long-time listeners, will know that I've spoken about the Scotch professors and this idea of the Scotch professors before, i.e. the Scottish pioneering footballers who took football across the world, and Andrew Watson-Hutton was one of the people who'd done this in Buenos Aires in Argentina. But the history of the Argentine national team itself kind of has its roots in this early migration that saw people from the UK and Ireland settle in Argentina and essentially start the national game over there.
That's right. The first game, 1867, played by British and Irish expatriates from the Buenos Aires Cricket Club, been handed a copy of the rules by a local newspaper editor and just tried it out. Took a little while for the game to take off, but over the sort of 1880s, then right into the 1890s where it really started getting organised. Alec Lamont founded the first league in 1891 with a 16 tournament made up of teams of British workers, mainly on the railways and on the companies making the infrastructure for Argentina. It was newly trying to rapidly industrialize and make the most of its agro export industries. So there's a lot of work on the railways, especially, which was a main driver in the growth of football in Argentina. So from their initial beginnings, so you see the first national team game, 1902, of the 11 players, 10 were of British or Irish origin, the other one being a young lad of Basque origin.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a little bit more about Thomas Patrick Moore, this person who became the first captain of the Argentine national side, because he's incredibly central to the story of the development of football in Argentina, but also, and more specifically to our conversation, the national football inside.
Yeah, so Juan Jose was Thomas's brother. He was son of Irish manager on the estancias or large agricultural farms in Argentina. He was sent back to England along with his brother Eugenio to study at a college in Manchester, which later produced such people because of its link with Manchester City. Had the likes of Jadon Sancho and Phil Foden study there as well. But the likes of these players, because they studied at the Buenos Aires English High School, run by Alexander Watson-Hutton, who was the real driver in making football as important as it later became in Argentina. Although Alec Lamont founded the first league, he was the driver behind which fell away after just 1 year of operation. 1893 set up the second incarnation of the Argentine League, which, following various splits later on, the current AFA, Argentine Football Association, can really trace its roots back to Watson-Hutton back in 1893, and Moore was one of the students at the high school whose players later became the club alumni, which was probably the first really great football club in Argentina, won multiple championships before its dissolution in 1912.
Yeah, it's one of the most important clubs in the history of football in Argentina, arguably. And the other sort of 4 or 5, maybe 6 clubs, if I remember correctly, that set up around that time and contested the first league title were the exact same. But you've provided some important context there, Mark, because you have this theme of migration, industrialisation, British migrants coming to work on railways, and you also have this aspect of cricket and rugby playing an important role as well. Argentina's a really good case study for looking into the history of football development for this, because it's really through all of these things that people from the British Isles were able to spread football across the world in different countries for different reasons and within different contexts. But with Argentina, you really had a mix of everything. And of course, all this eventually then led to the Argentine national team setting up. But just before we move on to that, and we move on to their kind of early period of founding, tell us a little bit more about the context of Argentine society at the time and how this would play into football.
So at the time, football was really played by the middle classes and the Argentine upper classes who were being educated at the British private schools. Physical education at that time in the state schools in Argentina was really based on the European gymnastic ideas. So it was really only the British and Argentine private schools that devoted themselves to team games like football, rugby. So it's really from the higher echelons, the society or the middle class, the football initially started. but then as diffused mainly through Argentine youngsters being educated at some of these schools, who are then sort of going home and diffusing it in their local neighbourhoods amongst their Argentine colleagues, and also amongst the British railway companies, most particularly, because obviously, as well as the British, there's massive migration into Argentina from the Southern Europe, mainly Italy, Spain, obviously some Germany, some France.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's where you really start to see the dissemination as players started playing in the break times at work and at the weekends with the introduction of the Saturday half holiday by British companies, as well as obviously the Sunday rest day. So it's really on a very parochial level that company clubs or in local neighbourhoods where youngsters in particular were important in just getting together and playing the game and forming their own clubs as a way of ingratiating all these disparate immigrant communities into a new local identity, which was unique to that particular area, which they could all share together despite their disparate national origins. So again, given a sense of local identity, which wasn't necessarily available in other forms of society.
Absolutely. And it's that kind of divide that we see all over the world when football is kind of entering its fledgling years here, because you've got, on one hand, the rules of the game being formulated from these private schools, and to go back to the early example in England, these gentlemen amateurs who would play it for the love of the game, didn't believe there should be such a thing as fouling because you shouldn't be allowed to tackle each other and things like this. Whereas then you have the working people decide to take the game up, and the entire dynamic of football changes completely. And we see this the world over, but in the context of Argentina, I think migration is so important because, even just from the stories of the football clubs today, you've got Boca Juniors taking their colours from the flag of a Swedish ship, which was docked at the harbour in Buenos Aires when they first started out. You have clubs and areas in Buenos Aires named after places in Italy, like Palermo. And Palermo Football Club, who once existed in Buenos Aires as well. So it's fascinating seeing just how much migration actually played an impact on the landscape of football in Argentina at this time.
Absolutely, it's absolutely essential to the growth and creation of a new Argentine identity, because as everyone miscegenated, that was a way of creating a unique Argentine identity that was common to everyone, not through language, not through religion necessarily, but from just a shared level of game.
Exactly. Of course, this all leads into the very first Argentine national game in 1902, but they did play fixtures beforehand, albeit in a different form. We've had discussions like this in the podcast before, particularly in the episode with the first Matildas. It's a little bit different in, I suppose, the early 1900s, because many national teams, in air quotes, they would have played fixtures, but they would have been made up entirely of players from one or two football clubs, or they might have been one football club who turned out and called themselves like an Argentine Select, for example, or a representative side or something along those lines. And I think the very first time Argentina actually played under any kind of banner of being Argentina was against Uruguay in 1901, but the side that contested that fixture from Uruguay was a side called Albion FC, and they also included, as well as all just being from one club, they included, a kind of select pick side from other clubs in Uruguay.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd say 1902 is the first time that the two sides were picked by the respective national leagues or associations as such. So I'd say it is a moot point about whether 1901 or 1902 were the first date, but I think most historians now take 1902 because that was the first one picked by the respective associations.
Of course, yeah. No, that makes sense. And again, it comes back to this idea of, are you a national side or are you a representative side? Because though they may not seem different, they are very different and distinct things. And it's important to remember that when we look at this, kind of branch in this era of football history, that we bear in mind that a lot of what would be called national teams were turning out as a Scotland 11 or an England 11. Saying that you're a Scotland 11 or England 11 is completely different than saying that you're a Scotland or England national team. But as far as international debuts go, it couldn't have went much better for Argentina because they ran out 6-0 winners against Uruguay, one of their eternal rivals.
That's right, and also the game created so much interest. The local shipping company put on special ships to take them across the River Plate. So, in a sense, you could say it's a start of commercialization of football in South America too.
Mm.
So as long as you had a ticket for the game, then you could get discounted ship tickets to go across to Montevideo. So it's important in several other ways apart from just the first international.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's interesting as well that this kind of bleeds into what would become the culture of fandom in football in Argentina, because it was an incredible spectacle. A lot of people turned out to watch it. And it's really from here that you can see the beginnings of the fervent support and the supporter culture that exists around the Argentine national team today. Because, and again, this is sort of down to societal context and political and social history amongst everything else, because among the countries in South America, all incredibly patriotic people, all love their countries, but Argentina's a little bit different in that sense.
Yes, to say, because at that point, it's such a hybrid society because of migration from all different countries, Spain, Italy, as I said, and right across Europe and even the Middle East. There's a lot of immigration from the Levant. So really was just a chance for people to be Argentine in a way that really wasn't opening other directions.
Exactly. I mean, at this point, we could really say, you know, the rest is history, I suppose. Because they really just kind of did jump from success to success. And I guess the purpose of our conversation, though, is to kind of dissect everything that really happened. Well, I say everything, but, you know,
Yeah.
the kind of story of the Argentine national team between their founding and their first World Cup, and them, you know, kind of announcing themselves on the international stage, because a lot of people might not know that. But I mean, it was really just a case of them going from strength to strength out with, you know, these periods of dictatorship, of strife, the military junta, etc. But,
Yeah.
you know, for the most part, from the second that they became a national team, they were pretty successful.
Yeah, although arguably neighbouring Uruguay were a lot more successful,
Mm.
probably up until the 1940s. They were South America's first representatives at the Olympic Games in 1924. An opportunity which Argentina missed out on because of internal disputes in its governance. Caused a lot of upset in Argentina because obviously as a larger neighbour, and they felt they were a bigger, more successful nation, even though results up to that point would argue against that, with Uruguay being remarkably successful against them, given their comparative size. And the 1924 success of Uruguay was paid in Argentina as a shared Rio Plate success, rather than, well, they sort of tried to piggyback on the success of Uruguay by claiming it was a regional success rather than a Uruguayan success, which they could almost claim a part of, even though obviously they weren't there. And obviously, as the 20s progressed, 1928 in Amsterdam, the two countries meet in the Olympic final. And again, 2 years later in the first World Cup final in 1930, both of which won by Uruguay. So there's already beginning to be this needle between the two countries over bragging rights and regional football dominance. Say at this point in Brazil, until the late 30s, really weren't even at the races as far as sort of being a regional superpower at football was concerned.
And of course, one thing that Uruguay will always be able to hold over them is that they are, well, you can probably trace the origins of, well, you can trace the origins of the World Cup to them.
Yeah.
It's the home of the World Cup, you could say. It's where the first official tournament was held. And I think that is the thing, because I think it is, well, it's kind of easy to overlook how much Uruguay was influential within the region at this point, how powerful they actually were as a footballing nation, comparatively, especially, you know, with their relative size to both Argentina and Brazil and other countries. Uruguay were one of the world's first global football superpowers.
Absolutely. And again, as you mentioned, the Scottish influence in Uruguay was especially through the likes of John Harley, was perhaps even more pronounced there than it was in Argentina. In Argentina, history is kind of rewritten by the journalists at the time. There's a famous guy called Ricardo Lorenzo, who went under the pen name of Borocoto in the main sports magazine in Argentina, El Gráfico, in the 1920s and 30s, who sort of tried to erase the initial British influence and say that Argentina developed its own brand of football, which was skillful, off the cuff, inventive, which was invented in the sort of waste ground kickabouts of suburbs of Buenos Aires. Although I would argue that was a little bit mischievous because some of the early players of British origin, like Watson Hutton's son, Harry Hayes later on, would have played in exactly the same way themselves. So if you go to the industrial cities of northern England and central Scotland at the time, you'd probably find exactly the same there, jumpers for goalpost type scenario. And I think there's not, at that time especially, a lot of difference between working class football in Britain or Argentina at the time. But this narrative is one that's stuck ever since. It's become known as La Nuestra, or our way of playing, and it's stuck until the present day, where the accent on dribbling and creative play. And so Messi's obviously currently the exponent of that, obviously in his day, Maradona, and others before that too. But I think this whole thing was perhaps born a little bit of myth-making by nationalist writers at the time, early in the 20th century.
But at the same time, those things that became so crucial to Argentine football, their way of playing, all the language that surrounds it. You know, we'd done a podcast episode on the language of football in Argentina with Christopher Hilland last year. These things are really now cornerstones of football identity in Argentina, and you know, the early influence of these things, the early fanaticism that these concepts created is really hard to kind of explain and put into words. It was hugely influential to the point that it was a phenomenon across the country. It really swept over them, much in the same way it did in England and Scotland, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely fundamental. Yes, obviously there were periods, certainly during the mid 20th century, when things went the other way, and there was supporter resentment against that. And when you got your anti-football era, the 1960s, like crowds plummeted. Obviously, there were other social things that came into that.
Yeah.
Being under dictatorship and social and economic crisis, which did affect Gates too, but it was mainly the fact that the football on show was just so boring to the Argentine palate that crowds simply stopped going in the numbers they did in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah. We'll probably get onto this a little bit later on. There's some comparisons that we can draw there with football in Argentina now, especially with how the game is kind of perceived now worldwide, and how crowds haven't necessarily declined, but obviously the absence of away fans has diluted the culture slightly, and the football being played is probably a little less technical, a little less full of flair, and a lot more direct than it used to be. Tell us about some of the seminal moments of the Argentine national team's history through this period.
So I guess the golden period of this style of football, as it's known, would be the 1940s, when under coach Guillermo Stabile, they won every South American championship during the 1940s, bar one, playing amazing football with the likes of Jose Manuel Moreno. Was probably a bit of a Gaza type character, liked to drink, like the nightlife, but would turn up and absolutely demolish the opposition next day. And also a lot of those members of that side were from the River Plate La Maquina side, which so dominated domestic football during that decade too. Boca Juniors and San Lorenzo also had amazing sides during that period. So you see the real high point of Argentine football probably during the 1940s. That comes to a massive halt in 1948 when the players go on strike over freedom of contract and other economic demands about the maximum wage, etc. And that really impacts on Argentina's national progress. And also, with the coming to power of Juan Perón in the 1940s, Argentina withdraw from the 1949 South American Championship and the 1950 World Cup. Although it's never put in print anywhere that it was officially forced by the Perón administration, it's definitely clear that pressure was brought to bear on the FA not to put Argentine prestige at risk by not fielding a team that would be competitive enough to be really amongst the top contenders. And say it's not until the sort of early to mid 50s that the national team really recovers from the loss of players that went abroad to Colombia, like Di Stefano was never seen in an Argentine shirt again. That 48 strike and the keep being away from major international competition. Again, 1954, the teams withdrawn from the World Cup. So that really hinders because they're not playing against the best of Europe. The likes of Brazil, Uruguay move on in terms of the best in South America. And when they sort of come out of their international hyphenation 1958 World Cup, they're absolutely completely destroyed in the group phase 6-1 by Czechoslovakia. And that really is a massive seminal moment in Argentine football history and sets the tone for the next sort of half century, or certainly the next 20 years. Coming up to a time when Cesar Luis Menotti takes over the Argentine team, which is going to host the 1978 World Cup. So obviously, in between, the reactions are sort of, well, how do we deal with this massive shock? And that's where you see the accent on athletic, tactical football, which really bores Argentine crowds. Has mixed results internationally, but certainly reaches its nadir sort of 1966 initially with the animals trope at the World Cup, where Ratin sent off and the nasty aftermath of the game. And then later in the decade, with the Estudiantes club side, which just wreaks havoc all over South America, and in the Intercontinental Cup finals they played against likes of Manchester United and AC Milan as well. Again, reached another nadir in 1969 when they failed to actually qualify for a World Cup for the first time ever. So they don't even make it to the World Cup in 1970. And say that again, see another sea change in the way things are looked at. And you start to see a return to classic Argentine values of La Nuestra. So especially with Chacarita Juniors initially in 1970, but obviously 1973 Hurricane win their first title of the professional era under Menotti, playing the way that we've come to know him through the Argentina National Team in the 78 World Cup.
Yeah, some really important context that you've mentioned there, Mark. I think just to highlight one in particular, obviously the appointment of Perón to the presidency, you know, as you said, it does set the tone for the next couple of decades of social, sporting, political and economic history in Argentina moving forward. The player strikes are massively important as well. We've not really touched on the fact that since it founded, the Argentine Football Association has has never been particularly stable.
No.
They enjoyed changing the rules, they enjoyed changing their formats, something that still exists today. And this is a big part of the reason why players went on strike. But it also bleeds into the fan culture because a lot of the supporters in Argentina see the AFA. I don't know if saying that they're the enemy is the right term. That's maybe a bit extreme, but you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
They don't see them as very competent. You know,
Absolutely.
They're willing to back their players. They back their clubs.
Absolutely. Say in the context of the strike, the political pressure was definitely on the side of the clubs rather than players, and again, that's what really set back Argentine football for decades.
Yeah, exactly. So then we get into this era of the junta and Argentina's World Cups, and this is really where they come into their own on the international stage, isn't it?
Yeah. Lots been made of the junta's influence in World Cup winning 78. I would argue perhaps it's not quite as strong as it's made out. I mean, the decision to give Argentina World Cup was made during democracy in 1966 under the presidency of Arturo Illia. And most of the preparations for the World Cup initially under the Prime Minister regime, sort of 72 onwards. Argentine economy in complete disarray at the time. Very little had been done, and it's really there that the junta sort of, obviously they take over in 1976, overthrowing Perón's wife, who succeeded him as president. Some members of the junta saw it as an unnecessary drain on resources. Others saw it as obviously propaganda coup, which ultimately they used it for. To show the world that Argentina was a modern, progressive, and I don't mean that politically, but society. And they rapidly get on with the World Cup, build new stadia, etc., and infrastructure. Although many would argue some of that, well, much of that turned out to be a white elephant in the end, in common with many sort of massive sporting events. Ended up being, given the international view of the junta, that in some respects they could get things done and were modernising Argentina. Obviously, their human rights record completely rooting that as well. Also, at the time, you got the Montenegro rebels against the junta, again, using the World Cup as a vehicle for obviously propagating their views as well, where they famously hijacked a television broadcast during one of the early games of the tournament, which was obviously a huge embarrassment to the regime. And also you see, obviously, the presence of so many international journalists and visitors gave the opportunity for the ordinary people, especially the mothers that have disappeared, to make their case internationally to try and put pressure on the Argentine junta to stop their genocide of the left-wing opponents.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the disappeared actually, because it was really through this tournament that the plight of the disappeared reached an international audience and began to put serious pressure, external pressure on the junta from outside. The disappeared are people who were forcibly kidnapped and more than likely murdered by Argentina's regime during the years of the military junta. The mothers of the deceased, many are still fighting today for justice for their family members or sisters, aunts, other family members and things like that. It's a horrible period in Argentine history where the regime really carried out a systemic targeting of its own people and arrested, tortured, killed them. Unfortunately, something that still happens in the real world today. So, bear that in mind as we're coming up to another very important World Cup this year. And there's already significant pressure on the US for what's going on with ICE. It's actually quite interesting thinking about the parallels with the disappeared and how ICE are treating people today. So I suppose that's something to bear in mind for people as we come up to World Cup 2026. Obviously, as you said, this tournament was really people's first, I guess, exposure to how brutal the military junta in Argentina actually was. But of course, then things take another turn and this becomes very prominent within football culture at the offset of the Falklands War, when it really bleeds into English and Argentine football culture, and the needle that already existed between the two sides takes on another element because it becomes explosive at times. It becomes incredibly toxic, more toxic than it already was, and you can tell that there is genuine hatred between the two sets of supporters.
Absolutely. So for the Argentine side, the players as well, I mean, Maradona talks about it extensively in his autobiography, although AFA and the English FA sort of both try and tone down before the massive quarterfinal in Mexico 1986. Obviously, the toxicity that surrounded the game, to try and tone it down. And in some of the press conferences, Maradona would say, oh, it's just a football game. It's nothing to do with politics. But obviously, privately, himself and the other Argentine players, especially likes of Maradona, who would have been of an age potentially to be called up as a reservist in the Falklands if had not been for his football career. It felt really close to home for them in a way that it didn't so much for the English. I know Glenn Hoddle mentions in his autobiography that almost shocked him just how wound up the Argentines were by the Falklands-Malvinas War, whereas the English, it wasn't the same. I guess as each say that when you're on the winning side in any conflict. And there was not the same passion amongst the English players as compared to the Argentine players. And obviously on the terraces, say both sets of fans basically treat the game as the extension of the conflict.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And again, if you watch videos back from it and things like that, you can clearly see the animosity and the hatred that exists between not just both sets of fans, both sets of players on the field of play as well. Whenever they do play, and thankfully, eventually the military junta is overthrown. We could probably have another podcast episode on that and how that influenced Argentine football. But the junta is eventually overthrown, and it really kind of ushers in this new era of social and political history within Argentina. But football struggles a little bit during this time. Obviously, you have Maradona and you have Argentine players really coming to the fore, especially in Europe during this period of time. But really, moving through the 80s and getting towards the 90s, there's a little bit of a lull and a slump. Maybe not so much amongst the fans, but certainly on the pitch in Argentina. You also have this, again, I know I'm skipping forward quite a bit going into the 90s here, but you also have this devastating loss to Colombia in the World Cup qualifiers as well.
Yeah, that's especially more powerful because they'd gone on a 31-game unbeaten run beforehand. So many riders had sort of seen the decline slowly come in. They'd won back-to-back Copa Americas in 91, 93, but some said that some of the team was getting old and jaded. Obviously, you got this new Colombian side the likes of Valderrama, Faustino, Asprilla, amongst others, who were sort of really a joy to watch and arguably playing in the style that Argentina is most famous for. Whereas at that time, really, Argentina was all about the goals of Batistuta. Really, it's not capturing the imagination the same way as it had done previously. And say the 5-0 defeat in El Monumental Stadium, September 93, was another seminal moment where it really caused a lot of reflection about Argentine football. And although it's not seen in this straight away in the senior squad, but there's a lot of work done at youth level. Jose Peckerman comes in as the youth team coach and really starts to regenerate ideas of Argentine La Nuestra and the classic Argentine way of playing. And you see them winning the World Youth Cup in 95, 97, again in 2001. You see your likes of Ayala and players like that starting to come through. You do start to slowly get a resurgence of a better Argentine team playing to its usual style. So they qualified really well for the 2002 World Cup, but obviously at the same time you've got the massive economic crash that absolutely devastates Argentina. Then you start to get a disconnect between the team and the fans, because you've got these highly paid millionaire players in Europe against people who have just been thrown into poverty from the middle classes in Argentina itself. And then when they failed to get out of the first round of the 2002 World Cup, there becomes an increasing disconnect between fans and team, which really has stayed there ever since, right up until the recent success under Scaloni. It's only really since he came back in, the whole dynamic of the team's changed a bit, where it was argued in 86 that Argentina was Maradona plus 10 Japanese in terms of workers working on behalf of Maradona to get the best result for the team. And in a sense, that's happened under Scaloni with Lionel Messi. Obviously, he's getting older. He's not quite as dynamic as he was before. So you've had youngsters like Rodrigo de Paul, Enzo Fernandez, Alexis McAllister, Julian Alvarez, doing a lot of the donkey work stuff for him, but obviously you still got the Messi genius who ends up helping the team to achieve results that have been missing for so many years.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just during this period as well, and we'll actually get on to Scaloni and the 2022 World Cup final, because probably speaking for a lot of people when I say it's one of the best World Cup finals that I've ever seen. I mean, bear in mind, I'm only 30, so there's only a few that I can actually remember, and there's even less that I've actually watched, but that's certainly up there. But just, you mentioned the economic crash, and I said, at the beginning, we're going to speak a little bit after this about the actual culture around the national team, but you mentioned the disconnect that the economic crash caused as well. What was Argentine society and the wider feeling around the Argentine national team like at this time? Because, a lot of people weren't actually able to attend games because they couldn't afford it. Things were pretty challenging in Argentina at this time. And as I said, you mentioned the disconnect with the national team. That really manifested itself. It really, really came to the fore where people did actually feel like this national team didn't represent them anymore.
As I say, there was so much hope going into 2002, but especially losing to England and just failing to get the right result in the last game against Sweden, where they just could not impose themselves at all. It was just felt that obviously the hope was they'd go to 2002, do really well and lift the spirits of the country, and the exact opposite happened. And just think the economic difference to these sort of multi-millionaire players who weren't based in Argentina, obviously they're all the vast majority based in Europe, one or two in Japan as well. But obviously none of them were experiencing what the Argentine people were going through, and I think that's what really caused the disconnect. So when they came back for future qualifiers, it was nothing like the same. And you had Marcelo Bielsa as coach at the time, qualified really well for 2002 World Cup. His style of play was a little bit more mixed between European styles and classic Argentine styles, and it wasn't to everyone's taste, and there was he wasn't as well respected in Argentina at the time as he's probably been subsequently, retrospectively, been credited with.
Yeah, I'm with you. But of course, this all kind of led really nicely to 2022, and there was a lot of heartache before then, particularly for Lionel Messi.
Yeah.
And as someone who's been part of this generation that's grown up watching him, so many people wanted him to win that final because they wanted him to be able to say that he's won a World Cup. Obviously, and for a player of his caliber and ability, it would be a travesty if he hadn't won a World Cup, right? But I mean, there was so much controversy, so much heartbreak, so many issues beforehand. But in 2022, they really managed to get it right. But at the same time, that was another generation of Argentine players that had come through. It felt like that the reason that to me it felt like a bit of a sweeter win, because it really did feel like that this was an Argentine side and generation of players coming to the end of its cycle, but they still managed to win the World Cup.
I think to an extent, I mean, really, it's only like Di Maria and Messi say we're coming to the end. There was a lot of players at the start of their cycle.
True.
Like Emi Martinez had only made his debut just before the 2021 Copa America. A lot of defense, Cuti Romero and Alicia Martinez, for example, again, had only made their debuts a year earlier. Some made their debuts even later, like Fernandez and Alexis McAllister. So it was a good mix of up and coming players and new players who were just hungry, but also importantly, they hadn't been part of that messy era of losing all those finals. The serial loser sort of club that they'd been before, so they kind of were free of those mental constraints and hang-ups that perhaps previous generation of Argentine players have had, and also along with the fact that there've been so many big ego coaches, likes of Sampioli, Maradona. When he was coach, was a bit of a disaster, to be honest.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, Scaloni really only got the job because the AFA was too skint to hire anyone else. So no positions by Marcelo Gallardo or Simeone out of their contracts. He was just a holding, and then he did quite well at the 2019 Copa America, where he got in a third place. Well, disputed semi-final defeat to Brazil. He'd started to build something early on, and obviously, by right from his performances, he got to keep the job permanently. But it was almost kind of a lucky punt by the AFA that it all turned out right in the end.
Yeah, true. That's a fair point. It's exciting. It's still an exciting time for fans of Argentine football. Still an exciting time for fans of the national team specifically. But let's talk a little bit about the culture surrounding the national team specifically. Obviously, we can talk about the wider culture of Argentine football, and we've done that recently in some of the articles that have went up on our website, and I guess more generally through some of our podcast episodes, like about ultras. And people have obviously seen the videos. They know how passionate Argentine football fans are. But as I said earlier in this recording, specifically around the national team, it's really a level of fanatic support that isn't really seen elsewhere in the world. Like, obviously, we've all seen people on the stands at World Cups and at continental tournaments like the Asian Cup or the African Cup of Nations or the Euros or whatever. We've seen fanatic supporters and what they can bring, people dressed up, African fans playing vuvuzelas and other traditional instruments. But when it comes to Argentina, it really reaches a different level of fanatic support, doesn't it? Can you explain to us why that is, Mark?
I think in sort of recent tournaments, I mean, 2014, obviously, was played on their doorstep in Brazil, but there's just hundreds of thousands of Argentines went to support the team and just took over the stadiums. I mean, even go back to 98. I mean, you look at the Saint Etienne second round game against England, the Argentines completely, despite the fact that the country's economy was in ruins, they are just so passionate about, especially the social economic circumstances of Argentina. Certainly this century, the last 20 years, has been so poor and pitiful that they just look for any outlet or give them a sense of well-being. And certainly 2022 gave them that. So any opportunity where they think they can do well, I think they just see themselves in the 11 men on the pitch in blue and white shirts as an extension of their own self-perception. So that's the one thing they are good at internationally. Perhaps not so well renowned for other cultural exports necessarily.
100%,
That
yeah.
is the one thing where they lead the world and wherever the whole world knows them for their football. And I think it's just a way of self
celebration as much as anything else. It's the one thing in Argentina that, despite the best efforts of its actual governing association, that actually works, and in such a fantastic way over the sort of last 3 or 4 years, through success in the two Copa America wins and the World Cup win, but in also competition of the team, the players do seem really to connect with the fans and say the outpouring after the 22. I mean, that far exceeding anything that happened in 86 or 78. So I think it's just really, they're just desperate for anything that they can cling some kind of hope to that makes their life a little bit better than their daily lives in Argentina would otherwise be.
That's a really important point that you've made at the end there, though. I think a lot of people from outside of Argentina attach themselves to the Argentine national team. I mean, for a number of reasons. Like I mentioned this on one of our Patreon exclusive episodes, Killing Maradona, with David Arrowsmith, his upcoming book, that, you know, the perception of Maradona in England is completely different to the perception of Maradona in Scotland, in Ireland, Wales, and elsewhere. You know, for a number of reasons, not just because of what he'd done against England, but, you know, a lot of people attach themselves to, I guess, what they would maybe think is being the Argentine cause. They want to see Argentina do well. They want to see Argentina as a national team succeed. And a lot of it probably is because they like the players and they like watching the players and they like watching the style of football. But Argentina, despite currently being world champions, have always had this kind of underdog culture around them that a lot of people feel like they want to attach themselves to. Well, I mean, they are incredibly resilient. They're incredibly resilient people, a very resilient national team. But despite being one of the most successful national sides, despite having this dearth of talent that they can call on, it always feels like they have this kind of culture around them where people see Argentina winning as seeing the underdog winning, which is quite bizarre in many ways.
Certainly given the resources available to other countries, even neighbouring Brazil, obviously Europe, that's very much the case. But say, I think in terms of the Argentine people themselves, I think it's just the one area of society, for want of a better word, is Argentine expression that actually you look at the Argentine football team and you see excellence. That's something they can then ascribe to themselves. For example, when the team weren't doing so well in the 60s, it wasn't the same. Obviously, they want the team to win, but they were very harsh and critical of the players, and they get on their backs. And it wasn't the same unconditional support. Certainly, you see in recent years. So it is a sort of double-edged sword. They can be equally against their own team as well. But obviously, they're passionate to see them win, but they're not necessarily as uncritical as same as most sort of larger countries. I mean, Brazil's the same, England to an extent. If the team aren't playing well, then the fans will get on their back, the press will get on their back. But because of the straitened circumstances, I think the the importance of football team is just that one thing that Argentina people can hang their hat on. And when it's going well, then say it's just that something that helps overcome the drudgery of sort of daily life, dysfunctional political and economic landscape.
It's both the vehicle through which they can escape the society they're in to a degree and forget about it, but also the platform where they can express their cultural identity and national identity the best, I suppose.
Absolutely right, yes.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, though. Just the way that the Argentines express themselves, the types of things that they do, both in a domestic sense and a national sense, I think a lot of national team supports wish they could do the same, but it is just that additional bit of connection that they're maybe missing in many ways anyway. Mark, this has been a fantastic chat. Is there anything else that you'd like to add just before we finish up for today?
No, just hope everyone enjoys the book. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll put links to the book in the show notes for this episode. Obviously, we're recording this in the middle of March. The book itself will be out on the 11th of May, which is when this episode is going to launch. So By the time you're listening to this, the book will be available to purchase. So, as I said, we'll put links to the book in the show notes for this episode so you can go and order your copy. Mark, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you very much to our listeners who tuned in for this episode. If there is anything that you want to ask us about this recording, if there's any topics you want to suggest yourself, then you can DM us on any of our social medias, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk as well. Please also remember to check out our exclusive Patreon feed. So an additional episode goes up there every Thursday, and you can subscribe for just £3 a month. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.